Well, thank you very much, and thank you to you all for being patient. And let me start off by extending, as I have this morning, my greetings to the Chair of the Elders and former President of Ireland, Miss Mary Robinson, and Deputy Chair of the Elders, Mama Graça Machel, former First Lady in our country, as well as Dr. Gro Harlem, who was the Director General of the World Health Organization. Receiving a visit from the elders is always a great honor for us. We always delighted when they come to visit us and meet a number of people around and across the country, just to get a sense of where we are. It was in 2007, on the occasion of Madiba's birthday, that it was announced that a group of independent global leaders would work together for peace and human rights, and that was when the entity of the elders came into existence. The two leaders who helped to bring the group together and inspired its work was obviously President Mandela and Archbishop Desmond Tutu, and they are certainly no longer with us, but in the work of the elders, their legacies endure, and we are very pleased with that. We've had a very fruitful engagement with the elders today. I'm grateful for the opportunity to have met with them and to report back to them on a number of issues that we are dealing with in our own country, issues that have to deal with development since our last meeting in 2019 when we last saw them. We have engaged on issues relating to the program of work of the elders. We exchanged views on how South Africa has progressed in the meeting, and particularly on issues such as the Sustainable Development Goals and our reconstruction and recovery process in the work of COVID-19. And achieving universal health coverage for all is an important area of work for the elders. We've been able to report back to them on the progress that we are making with regard to introducing the national health insurance, and access to quality and affordable health care, regardless of anybody's ability to pay, remains an important priority for the elders and for ourselves as well as a nation. We have learned a lot from COVID-19, and during the pandemic we invested in improving healthcare quality, and we were able during this period to deploy a great number of healthcare workers, and we repurposed a number of hospitals and filled hospitals as well, as we sought to strengthen our response to COVID-19. And we've also strengthened digital systems using NHI capabilities to build an electronic vaccination data system. And what we've learned as we informed the elders from the pandemic was to deepen our collaboration with the private sector in relation to patient management, sharing of testing capacity, and standardizing treatment guidelines. And this is what we were able to communicate to the elders. We are encouraged that the elders support our strong stance against vaccine inequality. We brought to the attention of the elders the serious challenge of COVID-19 vaccines produced on the African continent not having access to markets, including Africa itself. We reaffirmed our position, particularly also the position of the African Union, that multilateral agencies and philanthropists that provide vaccines to Africa should source them from the African continent. We believe, as we said to them, this is critical for the future of health security on our continent. We've also been able to report to the elders on the steps we are taking to address other critical issues with regard to climate change, and these include the establishment of the Presidential Climate Commission, and also inform them of the ambitious target for emissions reduction and the Just Transition Partnership we concluded with France, Germany, the United States, the United Kingdom, and the European Union at COP26. We agreed that South Africa's transition to a low-carbon future must be just, it must be inclusive, and it must leave no one behind. And the elders were able to infuse quite a lot of encouragement to us that whatever we do, it must be underpinned by social justice, it must be underpinned by procedural justice, and also we must keep an eye on restorative justice. And those we found to be very encouraging sentiments coming from the elders. So all in all, we've had a really good engagement with the elders, and they strengthened our resolve on addressing climate change challenges, and advised that as we do so, our process must be transparent, it must be inclusive. We must also keep an eye on ensuring that our people are taken along with. So I'd like to thank the elders for gracing us with their visit here and being present here in South Africa, and we look forward to seeing them once again. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, for that warm welcome back to South Africa. It's always a pleasure for us elders to come back to South Africa, and I'm delighted to be here with my wonderful sister, Graça Machel. This is the country of the elders' birth, as you said, Mr. President, and from whose roots, traditions and examples we draw strength as we continue to fulfill the mandate bequeathed on us here in 2007 by Madiba. Support courage where there is fear, foster agreement where there is conflict, and inspire hope where there is despair. It's been a privilege to speak with you, Mr. President, this morning about the interlocking crises facing South Africa and the wider world, and what steps we can take to support peace, justice, human rights, and a sustainable future at this critical time. I have to say, it has been a poignant visit for us, as I'm acutely conscious of the loss of our dear friend and brother, Archbishop Desmond Tutu. Graça and I had the honour and sadness to be present at his funeral in Cape Town with you, Mr. President.
Yes.
As elders, we held a wonderful celebration of his life in Cape Town earlier this week. A celebration because, Arch, we were with members of his family and his foundation. We miss him desperately. We miss his wisdom and his moral clarity when considering the state of the world affairs. But we also miss his humour, his laugh, his delight in mischief. And he would always break the ice to ease tensions and remind us of our common humanity. I think I've learned so much from Arch. Arch was the first chair of the elders, and his vision sustains us all today as we mark our 15th anniversary and plan our agenda for the months and years ahead. There are a number of issues that we discussed with the President this morning, and I'd like to say a few words on those in the spirit of Ubuntu. The concept of shared humanity that Arch espoused throughout his life, and to my mind, has never been more relevant. We talked, as you mentioned, Mr. President, about the climate crisis and the need for a just transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy. And I personally would like to start by acknowledging the long and proud history of coal mining in South Africa, the pivotal role it played in the country's development and prosperity, the equally distinguished contribution made by mine workers to the liberation struggle against apartheid, and the vital stake that mining communities have in today's South Africa. But it would be dishonest to pretend that coal has a future. It's right to ensure that vulnerable workers and their communities, especially women and young people, are supported and involved fully in the transition. And in this regard, the elders recognise and commend South Africa's efforts to build trust and to build societal consensus, community consensus around the transition through the multi-stakeholder Presidential Climate Commission. We met with some of the civil society representatives earlier. We've met with the President. We're going to meet with some ministers. And then we're going to have an opportunity as elders to have a Zoom call later with the donors. And when we've learned a few things that we should ask them, we will certainly ask them. That's what elders do. And I'm talking really about the deal reached at COP26 climate summit last year between South Africa and international partners to finance a just transition. These international partners, the United, as you mentioned them, must now put their money on the table, mainly grant money, and ensure this transition is a just one for affected workers and communities. The same sort of solidarity is at the heart of the national health insurance reforms in South Africa, another important item on our agenda today. The elders have long supported these reforms, which we discussed with the President during our last visit between Gro Brundtland of Norway, President Ricardo Lagos of Chile in September 2019. And the experience of COVID-19 has made the case for universal health coverage even more important and acute. NHI makes sound economic sense at a time when South Africa and countries all across the continent are facing fresh pressures from rising food and energy prices. Currently, South Africa spends 8.1% of its GDP on healthcare, but apparently half of these resources are spent through inefficient private insurance schemes that only serve 16% of the population, and mainly white. The scale of the racial inequality of healthcare provision is, it's quite shocking compared to the progress that has been made in other sectors since the end of apartheid. 76% of South Africa's white population belongs to one of these private health insurance schemes, compared to only 10% of the black population. Yeah. The remaining 84% of the population, which carries a far greater burden of disease, depends on your under-resourced public sector. And this is the very opposite of solidarity. Finally, we discussed the war in Ukraine and the ripple effects of that bloody conflict being felt here and across the world, from rising food and energy prices to growing calls for an end to impunity for war crimes and human rights abuses in conflict. It's vital that all members of the international community show solidarity here. Firstly, to Ukraine, in the face of the unjustifiable, outrageous and unprovoked act of aggression. And secondly, to the people in far-off countries. You had a word for it, Mr. President. Bystanders, I think. Yes, bystanders. Right. Bystanding countries, for whom this conflict adds further pressure on an already overstretched capacity to afford basic materials, food and energy to support their families. These two strands of solidarity can't be separated. Any equivocation on the first aspect makes it harder to build consensus and deliver action on the second. And the only actors who benefit from this inconsistency are the aggressors and profiteers who always exploit conflict for their own end. As always, my fellow elders and I are deeply grateful, deeply appreciative to you, Mr. President, for our rich and rewarding discussions. And I would like now to pass to my sister, Graça Machel, to say some words. Graça.
Thank you. Mr. President, dear President Cyril Ramaphosa, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak here today. And I'm at home, but at the same time, I have to be reminded that I am member of the elders.
Deputy President.
And the Deputy President. And I want to thank Mary for also giving me this opportunity. It is always an honor to be with you and our fellow elders, especially here in South Africa, where Madiba founded the group 15 years ago. There's very little I can add, but I wanted to say a few words about issues which Mary has touched upon. On the just energy transition, I reiterate the elders' support for President Samoda. Oh my goodness. For President Ramaphosa. I'm so sorry.
The same thing.
President Ramaphosa's leadership in pursuing a transition that leaves no one behind. There is so much work to do, but South Africa is on the right path. Mine workers and affected communities, including women and young people, must not be sidelined. They must be benefiting from our shift to a greener future. Their livelihoods must be at the heart of any change to the energy economy, and change must be their agenda as well. As I saw my own country with Hurricane Idai, or the current extreme drought across the Horn of Africa, the consequences for our continent of not addressing the climate crisis means greater and greater loss of life from extreme weather conditions. To complete this just transition, the partner countries, the rich countries of the global north, who promised to support South Africa in this courageous shift to the renewable energy, must now provide the finances they agreed upon at COP26. No delay, no excuse. I commend President Ramaphosa's effort to pioneer this new form of partnership, and I also recognize his moral leadership in doing so in a way that seeks to involve workers, communities, women, and young. The fight for climate justice is not only about economy and investment. It is, in essence, a social justice issue. I would also like to briefly mention the impact of the war in Ukraine on Africa. This is a hugely troubling issue for all the elders, and we spoke at length about it during our meeting in Cape Town this past few days. The impact of this war on food and energy prices is devastating for hundreds of millions of people in Africa. Across the world, over 260 million people unconnected to the conflict face extreme poverty due to the impact of the Russia's invasion on global food and energy prices, compounding existing inequality and the COVID crisis. We are all impacted by this war, and that is why world leaders cannot sit on the fence. All efforts must be made to bring about peace, not escalation, to this terrible conflict. It is right that we call out the double standards of those Western leaders who condemn aggression by Russia in Ukraine, but who turn a blind eye to such crimes elsewhere, sometime also in the world. But that does not neutralize the injustice and oppression of what we are seeing in Ukraine and the implications of the war for the bystanders countries. International solidarity against this war must be maintained, and world leaders must speak out and seek peace. As Mary has mentioned, the elders have been here in South Africa celebrating the life of our dear friend and first chair of the elders, Archbishop Tutu. We have recalled many of his wise words and reflected on his incredible sense of justice. We miss him dearly, and his goodness, his spirit of solidarity is needed now more than ever. Thank you once again, President Ramaphosa, for the opportunity to meet us and to discuss these issues today. And I'm sorry for having brought Samora into this.
Oh, no. I mean, I'm the one who feels honored to be associated with Graça Machel. So, wow, what an honor, really.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President, and happy anniversary to the elders on your 15th. The reason we're enduring the winter sun is my partners to the left, including some elders in our media fraternity. But I must just say that due to constraints on time and on protection from the sun, I think we're going to go for a round of 2 questions.
Yes.
I had a different number in mind, but I know my place. So, Zwa, if we can start with you as the SABC.
Thank you very much. Oh, okay. Thank you very much. Good afternoon to the elders and the president, of course. Just one question, but perhaps to be answered by both sides. Mr. President, you've spoken about the issue of the vaccines, particularly not being accessed by the African continent because we're getting them being flooded from outside. So in the next few days or even hours, you're traveling to your colleagues on the African continent. Is it a vote of no confidence on you as leaders of the African continent that you are able to agree and set up systems to be able to provide the continent, but the very same you as leaders of the continent are not using that, you instead go outside? Maybe to the chairperson, still one question. When this was set up in 2007, Mohammed Yunus basically said the world has no direction. 15 years later, is that direction? Thanks.
Zaya, I don't quite understand what the question is, because yes, I am traveling, and a number of us are traveling. There will be a number of heads of states in Malabo, in Equatorial Guinea.
Yes.
Is that what your question is about?
Okay. So, yes, my question is, Mr. President, you'll be traveling to your colleagues on the African continent. One of the concerns that you raised with the elders was that the facilities that we have here to produce the vaccines are here, but we are not using them because we opt for those ones that come from outside. And it's us, Africans, who ignore that which we have on the African continent and receive that which we get outside. So then the question, Mr. President, is, as leaders of the African continent, together yourself and your colleagues, are you having a vote of no confidence on yourselves as a collective, that you have systems but you choose not to use them?
Okay, now I understand. I understand fully. You will remember, of course, Mzwai, that when COVID vaccines started being available, we were receiving them from manufacturers outside of our continent, because they had started early on to develop these vaccines, and they mass produced them, and they started being used by various locales in the world, including ourselves. And it started dawning on us that rather than rely on vaccines that are made elsewhere, we could also have the capacity. And in fact, in Africa, we already had a manufacturer called Aspen that was already producing vaccines. However, they were doing it under a contract rather than under a license which would enable them to manufacture the drug substance themselves. And they've now acceded to manufacturing vaccines under a license where they will be able to manufacture vaccines from scratch, from the drug substance. So already the rest of the continent is also using vaccines that are made here in South Africa, made in Gqeberha, that are being made available to the rest of the continent. And a number of those are either on donation or on purchase now. Now that we are able to make our own vaccines here in South Africa, and a number of other countries are already doubling up to be ready to make their own vaccines, we are saying, rather than be reliant on vaccines that are made elsewhere, we want vaccines to be made here. Now, the problem is, Mzwai, the vaccines globally are purchased in a central way by Gavi, which was set up to purchase vaccines, particularly to distribute to developing economy countries, as well as COVAX, which we also supported. We are now saying, now that we have the capacity, we would like vaccines that are used for Africa to be purchased on African soil, made in Africa for Africans. That is our very strong stance. But we also want vaccines that are made here to also have other markets globally, to be able to be distributed in other locales around the world, because we now have capability that is equal to other manufacturers around the world. So it is not a case of us continuing to want to be reliant on vaccines that are made elsewhere. We're saying COVID-19, much as it has been a devastating event for the rest of the world, it has also given us what they call a silver lining. We now see a silver lining which gives us capability to manufacture vaccines. And believe you me, we don't want to manufacture only COVID-19 vaccines. We want to manufacture a whole range of other vaccines, be they malaria, be they yellow fever, be they a number of other diseases that we can deal with. Now, we now have the capability, we want to manufacture them here for the rest of the world. So we want to be self-reliant. The driving issue for us is self-reliance. Reliance on African capability, African vaccines, African ability to make these vaccines and to distribute them to the rest of the world. Thank you.
I would just like, as Chair of the Elders, to briefly comment also on the vaccine issue. First of all, to agree with all of the points that the President has made, and I think we were very aware of these in our discussions in Cape Town. But to make the wider point that there has been, a shocking lack of equitable access to vaccines. And that is the fault of the West, of that pre-buying for the West that the President referred to. The Elders have been very supportive of South Africa and India wanting the TRIPS agreement in the WTO to be modified as it had been for HIV. We have been very admiring of the way Africa has in fact responded, despite the lack of that equitable access. The way that the CDC has come up to a really good standard. We know, a number of the people involved there. It's been really remarkable. The way that African leaders have come together. It has been a remarkable story. But I just wanted to almost broaden, from the elder point of view, the perspective that the President has spoken about of being self-sufficient in relation to vaccines. We're learning now, between COVID, what's happening in China, and what's happening with long blockages now, that countries need to be more self-reliant in the future. And the food and fuel crisis is just driving that. I just wanted to say that, but I will come then to your question. Set up in 2007, I think it is true, and we feel it very much, that the problems we are dealing with are so much more difficult, so much more
complex.
Yeah, complex. The world is in a very perilous state.
Yeah.
It's in a perilous state for the number of the issues that the elders deal with, including the nuclear issue. You know, we were at a doomsday clock, my other deputy, Ban Ki-moon, and myself, in 2019, and the clock went back, or whatever it is, moved to 100 seconds to midnight. The highest point of the... I think, you know, next January, I wouldn't be surprised if it moves further. That's how perilous we are. The climate crisis is much worse. The equity crisis, the inequality crisis is much worse. I keep saying to my fellow elders, it's not our fault, you know, since we were set up in 2007. We can't really be for blame, as we would say in Ireland.
Yeah.
But actually, we're realising what is totally underwhelming is leadership. Leadership at all levels. And what is interesting is we are actually seeing leadership in two areas that pleases me a lot. We're seeing leadership in the women's movement and in women leaders, frankly, leading their countries. They did well in COVID countries, women-led with prime ministers or presidents, and we have more of them. And also young people, young climate activists, young people generally. They know that their future is at risk, and they are determined. And they want to be at the table, and they want the access, and they want the power. And that, again, is something very strong now for the elders, that we are intergenerational on all of these issues, and that we will try, yes, to pass on with, you know, with humility, whatever we have experienced, or what we have learned. But we are very encouraged, as Archbishop Tutu was. The last time, not the last time, but a few years ago, I was on a panel with him, and he was in front of young people, and he was laughing and throwing up his arms and telling them how much he loved them and believed in them and their goodness, etc. And we were being moderated by a woman journalist from the United States, and she said, "Archbishop Tutu, why are you such an optimist?" And he said, "Oh no, dearie, I'm not an optimist. I'm a prisoner of hope." And the reason why that's so important is that hope gives you the energy to address these issues. That's what I learned from him. We mustn't, see climate as apocalyptic. I can't even pronounce the word, but we must actually see it as the opportunity to move to a better world quickly, and that includes for South Africa. Yes. So we are prisoners of hope. We combat this, but we do know, and you're right, the world is in a much worse position than it was in 2007, and that's our challenge.
Thank you, Chair. In the interest of information equity, Mr. President, if I may I just invite the ENCA and Newsroom to pose your questions before we close. Sorry, Mr. President.
Oh. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you so much. Thank you. It's Govan Whittles from ENCA. Sticking on vaccines, Mr. President, I see the United States has just released the monkeypox vaccine from its stockpiles. Say monkeypox is now in 19 countries. Wondered what you think the risk of monkeypox is coming to South Africa. And then to the chair of the elders and the former president of Ireland, Mr. Robinson, you said that you wouldn't be surprised if the clock is past 100 seconds to midnight by January next year?
Yeah.
Fewer? Why is that? What is it that's happening that gives you that impression? Thank you.
Well, I'm not a medical soothsayer. I would hope that monkeypox does not come our way, and we pray and hope for that. And we will obviously want to be ready if it were ever to descend on South Africa, so that we can continue once again to defend our people and make sure that their health is safeguarded. But we pray, as I said, that it does not come our way, and we wish those countries well that are now having to deal with monkeypox, and we wish them strength, and wherever we are called upon to give assistance, we will be ready and willing to give assistance. Thank you.
The reason for my concern about the doomsday clock, and I'll be brief on this, is because if you look at the nuclear issue, the nuclear powers are reinforcing their arsenals. Having even more sophisticated, faster equipment and using artificial intelligence, which increases the risk, not just of accident, but of an AI hacking, all of that. Also, we're seeing moves that are regrettable, including the way in which President Putin put his army on nuclear alert. Now, I don't think anything actually happened, but even to say that was very worrying. And we see what's happened very recently in North Korea. We're seeing that the JCPOA with Iran has not been agreed. And are we facing a situation where, because Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons in the Minsk Agreement in 1994, was guaranteed its independence, etc. And then look what happened. First of all with Crimea, and now this terrible breach of the Charter earlier this year in the attack in February. So all of these things worry us greatly. The IPCC reports on climate, one after the other, and indeed the reports on loss of biodiversity, do frighten young people who say, am I going to have a future? In January, there will be 7 years to 2030. In those 7 years, the scientists tell us we have to reduce global carbon emissions by 45%. We're not heading in that direction, and I'm afraid this awful war in Ukraine hasn't helped, because it's distracted to needing more oil, and can we get gas out of Africa to help us with not trying to get gas out of Russia and so on? That's not the right approach. We have to. So I charged my fellow elders at our recent meeting, and we had a very good meeting, that we have to actually make effective partnerships, particularly with young people, that allow us, because we are few and elderly, but we have to help to get the voice of truth. There's a lack of trust in our world because of misinformation, and we have to get that voice of truth, of how serious things are and how we have to deal with them. And that's what we'll be working on over the next 5 years. Yeah.
Thank you.
Kampalani.
Thank you very much, Belana Pachadi from Newsroom Africa. I've written my question so I don't forget. It's intimidating to talk to elders. The rising prices of commodities will further exacerbate compounded challenges brought forth by to the poor, marginalized, even the middle class. Currently, they are not coping. So, in your talks and even in council to the SA government, advise to deal with these challenges, and especially because they have they could deal with healthcare. One of the good ones. And just to sneak just one more last one, Mr. President, leadership, they said it's underwhelming from your left, and women and young people should be at the helm. Perhaps encouragement to your home party to consider young people, feminine leadership, just to get the talk going for younger and feminine people to be encouraged to take up leadership roles.
I have to go first this time. All right. I've forgotten the question. What was it? Remind me again.
Cost of living.
Cost of living.
Cost of living, yes.
Cost of living, yes.
Very, very important. And we discuss it at very considerable length. It was already happening. The indebtedness of COVID, people, being trapped in their homes, had already had a high cost, particularly on women, particularly on vulnerable, marginalised communities. And then you have the inflation going up, and in particular, aggravated now by the war in Ukraine, the cost of food and fuel. And it does mean that we're in a changing world. And in that world, it's going to be important for countries to try to have, an intelligent food security. They don't have to be absolutely secure in their food, but they have to be, manufacturing and providing more. And, Africa has more potential land to use than any other part of the world, as we know. I'm going from here to the Mo Ibrahim Foundation, because I'm also on the board and prize committee, and I know that forum for the last few days have been talking precisely about Africa rising to the challenge, in particular of the high food and fuel costs, just as we as the elders were talking about it. And it's a changing world. We're moving much more to self-reliance, much more to not so much the long supply chains and the dependence from the outside, but more how, in a sustainable way, with clean energy, we can have a better future for all.
Can I say something
Please.
about this? On the same way where African countries took the advanced idea of looking inwards and say we have to produce vaccines ourselves and be self-reliant. You all know that Africa is a food importer. This is an opportunity to say, let's reduce importing food, but let's invest much more in internal production. As Mary was saying, we have the land. In some parts of the continent, we even have water. What now would impede us of really investing seriously in producing food for ourselves? In fact, Africa has the ability to export food. So this is a crisis which perhaps is telling us, let's take food production as a huge priority, and even to be able, as we are looking for exporting vaccines, one day to come and say we are self-sufficient and we can export food for those who need it.
Well, on the leadership question, this is a very difficult time to lead for any leader around the world, because the world and all countries are really facing complex problems and challenges. And we are also facing many of those types of challenges. The after effects of COVID-19 are huge. In our country, they've led to 2 million people losing their jobs in just 1 year. Even much worse than what we experienced in the financial crisis of 2008. Any economy that loses so many jobs means that it's facing huge challenges. The effort to regain those jobs and then begin to grow the economy to a level where it can increase jobs is huge. So that's what makes leadership very, very difficult and challenging. And in our own situation, we've had to deal with the July unrest of last year, which also led to loss of jobs and destruction of a component of our infrastructures. Now we are having to deal with the floods in KZN, Eastern Cape and the Northwest. A combination of all that means that it's a challenging period to lead. Now, clearly, if young people, women can come to the fore and take the baton and lead, any country welcomes that. Because, of course, we need new minds, new innovation, and new ideas for people to take the whole process forward. But working together, which is what I've often called for, putting all our mind power together, we can navigate our way out of these crises that we face. And let me say as I end, we've been through many crises before, as a nation and as a country. And the difficulties and challenges that we are going through now are crises and difficulties that we will be able to navigate our way through. And remembering that we're not the only ones in the world going through challenges such as rising food prices, rising inflation, and a whole range of other problems like unemployment. So we just need to look at everything in context and steel ourselves as South Africans that we have the wherewithal to navigate ourselves out of these problems. And succeed we shall, because that's what we are made of as South Africans. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President, and we wish the elders well for the rest of the program. Thank you very much.
Oh, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.